The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
The achievement gap in educational attainment and career advancement is one of the most worrisome social problems that America faces. African American and Hispanic students across the country are trailing their white counterparts in reading and math scores by wide margins. The gap has hardly shrunk despite massive increases in government spending on K-12 education and remedial programs like Head Start. Joining us to discuss what she thinks needs to be done to increase the achievement of low-income and minority students is Abigail Thernstrom, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and co-author of No Excuses, Closing the Racial Gap in Learning, and now the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Abigail Thernstrom, welcome back to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you very much.
In this program, I'd like to talk about a book that you co-authored with a guy named Stephan Thernstrom, who I take it is related to you.
Related to me.
Your husband.
Yes.
Former professor at Harvard, history department. And the book is called No Excuses, Closing the Racial Gap in Learning.
Correct.
Let's start with, what is the racial gap in learning?
By the time students get to 12th grade, black students have 7th grade skills, while whites and Asians have 12th grade skills. So blacks are on average, we're always talking about averages here, on average graduating from high school with a junior high education. And it is important to emphasize that the racial gap means blacks and Hispanics in comparison with whites and Asians, because the Asians are doing very well.
And even when you control for income, there's a gap, right? It's not just a poverty phenomenon.
Absolutely. There's a terrible gap, even controlling for income. And when you look at wealthy suburbs or upper middle class suburbs where blacks live, there's still a terrible racial gap.
So let's discuss this issue in two parts. Let's talk about very poor and disadvantaged blacks and Hispanics, but also the more middle class. And let's start with the more middle class. What's your explanation for their lower performance compared to whites and Asians?
Well, why blacks in middle-class families are doing as poorly as they are is a bit of a mystery, and a lot of people have been trying to study that question. But certainly part of it may be generational. That is, first-generation middle class, maybe their kids will do better. But there are striking differences between blacks and whites. First place, blacks watch an enormous amount of television, and this is true, much more television than whites and Asians do, and this is true for middle-class blacks, as well as kids from low-income families. Very few books in the households of middle-class blacks is one of the discoveries that has been made. But it does remain a little bit of a mystery.
Now, where do you come out on the don't act white controversy? And tell people what that is.
Right. The don't act white controversy is the controversy over whether black students essentially get the message from other black students: you better not study hard, you should concentrate on throwing a basketball and not learning your math, because learning math is a white activity. And there's a lot of baggage that goes along with that. You have to talk black, you have to date black, and so forth. I don't think any one factor is the total explanation here. I think too much can be made of that.
Now there's another argument that goes something like the following, and it's appealing to me because I'm cynical as can be. So my attraction to this argument is about cynicism, okay? And it goes something like the following. If I don't have to work hard to be rich, if my father's got or my mother's got a lot of money, I'm not going to work hard on average. Now, if it's the case that it is demonstrably easier for me to get into a college, get a scholarship, because of the color of my skin or my ethnicity, then cynical, Besharov says, I'm not going to work as hard. Not anything to do with race, having to do with the simple fact that I don't think I should work any harder than I have to.
Absolutely. I mean, the incentives are not there. The incentives for working hard have been reduced because of racial preferences in admission to institutions of higher education. There's no question about that. And in fact, there are racial preferences for in the workplace as well. So all up and down the line, you are giving students a break they know about on the basis of the color of their skin, and they respond. They respond, as you just said, in a logical way.
Now, it's hard to see the fix for the middle class issues that we've just talked about, this whole list of issues. What do you propose as the fix for the middle class racial gap?
Well, to begin with, the schools cannot be afraid to take on the cultural issues. And they cannot be afraid to say to those kids, okay, you're going to get into college. And I'll go back to that in a minute. But okay, you're going to get into college having been given a break. But you go to a college that you're mismatched with. That is, the average student is going to be academically stronger than you are. And you're going to have a tough time. You're not going to feel comfortable. And the chances of your graduating with a good degree are less.
But let me press you, because I almost think there's more hope for helping the disadvantaged blacks in the usually inner city schools or in the counties that are very disadvantaged. Tell us about those schools and those young blacks and browns.
Most inner city schools are dreadful beyond belief.
And that's because of government, right?
These are public schools, not because of government in the sense of inadequate funding. The D.C. schools, we're sitting in D.C. D.C. schools have, they've got more money than they
can count. But it's a governance issue.
Well, it's a governance issue. It's a teacher recruitment issue. It's an issue of who goes into K through 12 education in general, students with very low SAT scores. It's an issue of the low prestige of those jobs because they're not really professional jobs.
So I really do want to go to this point, which I think I saw in my own lifetime, which is the ability of government to deliver a decent school. I'm not yet going into the teachers. To deliver a safe school, a well-painted school, seems to have declined tremendously. And I think we should hold government accountable for that failure. Don't you?
I agree with that. And in fact, one of the important things to say on that score is that a number of charter schools, not all charter schools by any means, but a number of charter schools who are, and they are much freer from government control. They can hire teachers who don't belong to the teachers' unions. They can set their salaries. They can fiddle with their budgets. They can fiddle with the hours of school and the hours the teachers need to teach, and they can get rid of bad teachers and so forth. And this is all a matter of being out from under local government or state government. There are a number of wonderful charter schools, and some that have been in the process of expanding. But they're a drop in the bucket. They do show us what good inner city education looks like, what great inner city education looks like. And my favorite example is the KIPP Academies, KIPP.
We'll talk about the KIPPs in a minute, but so many inner cities have black elected officials, black
Right.
mayors,
Right.
black members of the legislature, and yet it doesn't seem as if the black elected leadership is as interested in education reform as the plight of the black students would suggest. So what's the political, what's the economic explanation for this? Is it just that the teachers' unions have the black politicians cowed?
They certainly have the black politicians cowed.
How do they do that?
First place, the teachers' unions elect Democrats. They are the single most powerful group in terms of democratic election. They get home early, they lick envelopes, they send literature with the students home, and they make or break.
So in a low turnout election, if I'm in a minority district, which traditionally has low turnout, any force like a teachers' union can have a disproportionate impact.
Decisive impact, absolutely. And when you're talking about school board elections, you're often talking about turnout of 10%, 8%, maybe a little above, but very few people very few voters can decide those elections, and the teachers' unions have gotten to them.
So let's stop dumping on the teachers' unions and think, because there's a lot of that, but let's look at some of the other seismic changes, right?
Right.
When we were growing up, we won't go there too far, being a school teacher was an important ambition for many women.
Correct.
And that was true through all American history, but certainly through the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s. This shifts. Sometime in the 60s and the 70s, horrors of horrors, you women end up going to law school, medical school, the whole world. We foolishly we men let you have the wider world. The result is, fewer of our best women are teachers, and the profession as a whole, right, just has a lower performance level. It's hard to see how you fix that.
You don't fix it except by structuring teaching so it becomes once again a real profession. But we talk about our lives and our own experience. When I was in college, one of my roommates went to law school, and she was one of 3 female law students at NYU. Now, obviously today there's, as you said, a revolution.
Yeah.
I mean, half of law school students are female, and more than half of medical school students are female. Revolution. How do you get women back into the classroom?
Men.
Or men, either one. A bad economy may do something, but you really got to restructure the teaching profession so that it is a profession and attracts highly skilled men and women.
So do you think the answer is money? Now, here in the District of Columbia, they were trying to offer very high salaries, $120,000, $130,000 a year, on the theory that that was going to bring better teachers into the system. Do you think that would do it?
I don't think the problem is money. There are all sorts of assistant professors throughout the higher education system. There are all sorts of even full professors in colleges in Maine and other rural parts that earn half of that at best. But they love what they do. They feel it's important. And they stick with it. And you can offer much less money. You change the job.
How do you change the job? How do you want the job to change?
I want the job, first place, to reward people who do a good job teaching. Most teachers get tenure after 2 or 3 years, and at that point they can stop doing a respectable job It is the incentive. The incentives are all wrong. Nobody cares whether they do a good job.
But I don't think that. I thought you had something else in mind. I'm always struck by the fact that the professions that don't seem attractive in a singles bar are the ones that are losing people, you know? I'm a librarian. Well, you know, that's unlike Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush notwithstanding. I'm a plumber. You know, there are just these jobs that you just don't say you have when you're in a singles bar, and I think school teacher is one of them. So I guess I want to ask you how we make people proud to be school teachers again, and I don't think it's pay for performance.
Well, there's a chicken and egg problem here. I mean, if school teachers, which comes first? I mean, if school teachers were cherished as being in charge of the many hours every day of the life of young people in their formative years, and I think their status would be different. But they're not cherished, in part because they are not, they're not very educated themselves.
What's the average? Do you remember what the average SAT is?
It's low. It's in the bottom quartile. Do you know what the?
I think it's in the 400s.
In 400s. I mean, it's really low. And a friend of mine has been teaching teachers, elementary school teachers, how to teach math. This is in Massachusetts. And when these teachers start out with him in his class, he has questions like, so, let me see if I get it straight. A fraction is actually a number. And he feels like tearing his hair out. What are we doing with such uneducated people in our classroom?
Well, one sees that in many places. But there is another part that we should talk about here. For the most severely disadvantaged children, black, brown, and some white, what we're looking at is pretty bad parenting. And in the old days, we used to ascribe it to different attitudes, different cultural attitudes, different histories. Now we sort of blandly call it the effects of poverty. How do you think about that problem and what to do about it?
I don't know how to fix, you are much more of an expert on this than I am. I don't know how to fix the larger problem, the cultural problem of what's happening in these parents' lives. But I do know that good schools, the best schools, keep these children very long hours. They see them on Saturdays as well. They keep them part of the summers as well. They become surrogate families. They want these children to spend as little time as possible at home, and they certainly don't want them to be hanging out on the streets in, you know, inner city Detroit, inner city New York, wherever. And I mean, I remember once asking a principal in Harlem, a high school principal in Harlem, New York, if you must have a wish list. What's your top item on the wish list? And he said, simple, I want the building next door, and I want the kids sleeping at night there, so they don't have to go home. They often don't go to a home. They're sleeping in a variety of homes. They're, you know, their mothers have got one boyfriend one night, another one another night. These kids are not mothered. I want to keep them.
And they don't have a place to study. Now, you mentioned KIPP academies, and I know that you like to talk about them. Now, some of the KIPP academies do have, in effect, foster homes attached to them, don't they?
When I knew the KIPP academies, which I mean, these were the early days, they did not. And I have not actually looked at what they're doing with these foster homes. What impressed me about KIPP was the quality of teaching, the dedication. KIPP teachers have to have a cell phone on 24 hours a day so kids can call them.
And parents.
And parents. Now, often teachers can't get hold of parents, but in regular district public schools, often the teachers don't know how to get hold of parents, and they don't have their own phones, and they don't have their own desks in a place where they can sit and call parents and try to track them down. I mean, it's, you know, this is part of turning teaching into a profession. And the level of dedication on the part that is demanded on the part of KIPP teachers, however, leads to burnout. There's no question about it. You cannot, for decades, if you want your own family, if you want a sane life, it's the very rare teacher that's going to be willing to keep on doing this.
But
they're saints.
There's a great deal of competition.
There is, among young people.
Among young people, and they, whether it's 3 years or 5 years or 10 years,
they do a great job.
Quite eager.
Yeah.
And I know of cases of young teachers who have been at the fanciest private schools here in the district, St. Albans, for example, switched over to KIPP, and you know, miss all the computers and all this, but are immensely more happy.
Exactly. And they're not paid more, by the way.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. So, before we close, because we're at the end, I want to ask you something that is, I think, not so much in the debate. I was at a meeting recently, and someone stood up and said, I don't know why everyone's against creaming. Why don't we help those people who are ready to be helped, so we can get at least part of the job done? Now, the KIPP academies of the world, all the charter schools, are essentially required to not cream, essentially required to either use a randomized lottery for people to get in, or some of them, actually in many states, can only take the most troubled children, which is one of the reasons I think why they're the results in these tests are not so good. What if we had a different approach that just said, you know, just as we like motivated students, and we're going to reward motivated families? How would you feel about that, and what would be the obstacles to doing that?
Oh, I don't have any problem with that at all. And the obstacles are this, you know, intense commitment to egalitarianism that's very in the culture, very deeply embedded in the culture, and is hard to break. But it's a problem in the regular district public schools as well. By the time children enter first grade, there's a huge spectrum in terms of academic learning. Some kids already know how to read in kindergarten. Others can't identify any letters or numbers. So you've got a problem starting very early. What to do about the kids who are ready to run?
But if you segregate them, right, I use the word deliberately,
right,
you can create a self-fulfilling promise. And I say this as someone who didn't learn how to read till the 3rd grade.
It can be self-fulfilling depending on whether you treat the kids who come in really far behind as belonging in the back of a bus, or whether you treat them as kids who need a lot of extra help.
But it doesn't look as if, I think people don't, I mean, I'm obviously pushing you here, but it feels to me as if the parents and the advocates for the children who start behind don't trust the system.
I think that's correct. They don't trust the system. But they're also very insecure themselves. They are not, you know, the equivalent of what I was when my kids were very young, ready to march in the school and scream about one bad teacher or you know, bad lesson or another. They don't. These schools are filled with authority figures as far as they're concerned, and I think this is particularly a problem with recent immigrants. And so, yeah.
Okay, let me ask you a question that you might not be prepared for. I know you might never write another book about education, but if you did, what would the title be?
still spinning our wheels, going nowhere.
So, in the end, you're not very hopeful.
I haven't. Our book came out in 2003, so it's 6 years now. If somebody asks me to write what the picture looks today, I have to say it looks the same. I don't have anything new to say. It's in the book. And it's a tragic story.
Well, that's a chilling thought. Abby Thernstrom, I'm going to say thank you for being so honest about an issue that is central to the future of our country. And thank you for being with us at Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
My pleasure.
And to our viewing audience, thank you so much for tuning in. This is Doug Besheroff from the University of Maryland. And if you'd like to write us with comments, questions, or complaints, it's PolicyWatch at UMD, that's UMD for University of Maryland, .edu. Thanks again. Abby, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.